Good
Good afternoon, everyone. Even though I can't see you, you can see me, I'm sure. I'd like to welcome all of the colleagues, friends, students, and family members to the retirement celebration for Professor Lindy Robison. But before I proceed, I want to make a quick announcement. So today's seminar will be recorded and shared with all the people that registered on the AFRE YouTube page. So I want you to be aware of that. And secondly, you will have an opportunity to ask questions after the seminar presentation. So please hold your questions till the end. And when you are about to ask questions, we would like for you to enter your questions in the chat box. And at the appropriate time, I will read the questions. So now I want to say a little bit as an introduction for our speaker today. Since this is his final lecture, I may go a little bit long, but not too long, because I want to give you a sense for how important his career has been to us and to many other people. So during his life and professional career, Lindy wore many hats, and many of his friends can attest to this. And he also made many important contributions to our department, MSU, and our profession at large. He has been an excellent scholar, a teacher, a mentor to many, and an inspirational leader. And part of his leadership included serving as the department chair for AFRE, and also as a leader in his church community. In addition to his professional life, he was also a great husband to Bonnie, a father, grandpa, and great-grandpa. And to many of us, we call Lindy a great friend. For me personally, in the last few years, one of the ways that I view Lindy is as a true servant leader. He has a great mind, and we all know that, and is intellectually curious and active. But even more important is Lindy's heart. Lindy has a compassionate heart, and he cares deeply about people. So prior to joining MSU in 1977, Lindy obtained his bachelor's degree from Utah State University and his master's from the University of Illinois, and then got his doctorate degree from Texas A&M University, which is where I also got mine many years later. Lindy is an accomplished scholar, as shown from many publications that he has had over the course of his career. He has published numerous books and articles, including the text for the department's capstone course in agribusiness management, AFRE 435, that he co-authored with two of his colleagues, Steve Hansen and Roy Black. Lindy taught the AFRE graduate courses in calculus for economists, mathematical statistics, and mathematical programming during the course of his career. Prior to joining FSU, he worked for the US government as an agricultural economist, and during the course of his career, he consulted for governments, private firms, and international organizations like the World Bank, particularly in Latin America. Lindy was also a visiting faculty member at Brigham Young University, University of Minnesota, and the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. His most frequently cited works include The Comparative Firm's Response to Risk, co-authored with Peter Barry, and a second work that is very well cited too is the paper on social capital reality, which was co-authored with Alan Schmidt, a colleague in our department, and Marcelo Siles. One of the things that Lindy is very well known for is his pioneering research in social capital. So Lindy has spent a lot of years asking the question on what is the role of social capital in terms of relationships of caring, trust, and regard. how does it affect the terms and level of trade? And he has looked at several applications of this question with regards to, for example, land and car prices, the likelihood of loan approval, and medical screening decisions. His most recent publication described the social capital motives, and he distinguishes between relational goods and commodities. Some of you may not know this, but yes, Lindy is retiring, but he's still very active in research. As a matter of fact, one of his peer-reviewed papers was accepted for publication just this past week. So he's still going strong, and I'm sure Bonnie will ask him to slow down significantly after today. Today's seminar presentation will focus on the high cost of cheap social capital. And with that, I'll pass the baton to Lindy.
Thank you very much, Titus. I appreciate that, and I thank you all for coming and participating. And we have a lot of to cover, so I'd like to begin. This is perhaps a little bit different than a traditional exit that maybe focuses on past work. This work is introducing perhaps a new line of research that builds on some of our previous work on social capital. So the outline of what I would like to talk about today is first introduce the concept of cheap social capital, maybe explain why it's called cheap, and then call attention to why cheap social capital imposes on all of us a high cost, and then at the end suggest some measures of how we can reduce the harmful consequences of cheap social capital. Cheap social builds on the concept of social capital. They both focus on relationships, both have objects, respond to the same incentives. And so perhaps to get started in our seminar, I could reflect for maybe one or two slides on how my interest in social capital started. Titus mentioned I spent a sabbatic year in 1984 at Brigham Young University. And while I was there, I wondered about, is there a connection between faith concepts that are important to me, such as sharing and caring and the golden rule? I wondered if those concepts had anything to do or any connection with what my career was focused on, namely economics. And so I started thinking about that question during my sabbatic leave when I returned to Michigan State along with Marcelo Silas. We formed a social capital interest group. We organized the first international conference on social capital, and then the rest is history, years trying to answer questions to social capital. And one of the reasons that my family is on listening to this seminar is because for years they've been begging, can we please talk about something else? And they are anticipating that there will be some other topics. Well, what is social capital? We've done a fair amount of work trying to arrive at a definition. In my mind, it really can trace back to Adam Smith and the theory of moral sentiments, the ideas of empathy and sympathy and trust and regard that one person or group would have for another person or group. at least that's of social capital lives in a lot of social science disciplines, and there isn't unanimity of definition, but I think this is one that I think I'm comfortable defending. What makes social capital particularly interesting to economists is that it produces two kinds of goods. One of them is called social emotional goods, and the second kind is attachment value goods. And these goods produce both social and economic consequences. And really, I don't think, at least I haven't possible to separate them. So the one kind of good is social emotional goods, which are intangible signals. They satisfy social emotional needs for internal and external validation, belonging. Of course, they're and then the opportunity to express empathy and antipathy. Here's some examples: people receiving an honor, achieving some goal, being welcomed by friends. Sort of everything, just everyday sort of events. We're exchanging these social emotional goods that change the way we feel, change our well-being. The second kind of goods we call attachment value goods, and these are things that get embedded with these intangible social emotional goods, and when they're embedded, they change the value and the meaning of them. And so our hometown, music, presents, flags, these organizations that we belong to, all are examples of attachment value goods whose meaning and value has changed. On the north east corner is the soccer ball from Castaway. Some remember the movie that Tom Hanks is stranded on a desert island with no one to talk to, and this Wilson soccer ball floats up. Actually, there's an interesting history behind the Wilson soccer ball, but we won't have time to go into that today. So much of what we have done in social capital has been to look at what happens when we include relational goods in commodity transactions. And we've looked at used cars, bank loans, farmland, cooperation among study teams, hiring practice, health screening decisions, income distributions, and so on. And one of the reasons that seems like perhaps a diverse collection of topics is that once you include relational goods in the exchange, it allows you to look at a number of transactions that typically we might not focus on as economists. Toward the end of that list is I've suggested that social capital theory and relational goods has allowed us to rationalize a lot of what, or at least some of what behavioral economists have referred to as predictably irrational choices. And if you would like the references to some of this work, I've listed my page at the end that you can refer to. So economists are familiar with Kenneth Boulding. He versified, "And love with longer pull than hate is slow indeed to propagate." The terms we associate with social capital, empathy, sympathy, trust, and so on, probably are close to caring or love. And the question I want to ask and address in this seminar is, what about the opposite of social capital? And I'm going to call that cheap social capital. And we try to ignore the topic, but lately it seems it's just become too important to ignore. And so I want to try and address the influence of cheap social capital, the opposite of social capital, in at least an introductory way so that we can think about what it has to say. And the essence of cheap social capital is social capital lives in networks. Only in networks of cheap social capital, the people share antipathy for an individual or group. So why are we interested in considering cheap social capital? And I think one of the reasons is that there is a set of predictably irrational behaviors that can't be explained or isn't explained by social capital, nor by the traditional neoclassical economic paradigm. For example, why do people spend resources to disadvantage another person or group when in the process their own well-being is disadvantaged? To me, as an economist, that seems counterintuitive. We can't understand really social capital or cheap social capital without first addressing the topic of commonality, something that two or more people share. And we can divide these into two classes, one earned or achieved, and the other set are inherited or ascribed. So the inherited ones we're born with, the others we have to acquire through our own effort. And we could refer to social identity theory that says we identify us because makes us different than them. And it's the commonalities that we use to identify who we are and who the other people that we're not. So I'm going to spend a couple of slides introducing the topic of commonalities. So here's a list of commonalities that we could earn. Our education, language, work and travel experience, hobbies, residences, membership in clubs, friends and coworkers, and so on. And so often when we begin a relationship, the relationship starts by referring to earned commonality, something that we both share. You see people introduced and they start asking and looking for things that they have in common. In contrast, commonalities that used to distinguish us from them that are inherited would be your birth date, your gender, genealogy, nationality, race, native language, inherited culture, and so on. There's probably others, but at least hopefully you get the idea that these commonalities can be organized into two categories. Now, social capital and cheap social capital is not formed by commonalities, but commonalities are a necessary condition. And when they allow us to exchange commodities or relational goods, and they're synergistic, then we start developing social capital, or if they're antagonistic or unsuccessful, we may start developing cheap social capital. So commonalities may be necessary, they're surely not sufficient for the creation of social capital. Now, there's an important distinction about networks where social capital lives that we distinguish, or one of the important characteristics is whether the commonality is earned or inherited. And of course, there's a continuum. But one thing about earned commonalities is that the size of the network and the membership is flexible, it can adjust. And we see a lot of commodity exchanges taking place in networks organized around weak, or what we call linking social capital. And in contrast, inherited commonalities leads to deep, what we call bonding social capital. And because they're more durable and perhaps require less maintenance, we find a lot of our relational goods being exchanged in these inherited networks. So you can imagine that a healthy society and economy depends on both networks of people organized around earned commonalities and those organized around inherited ones. So talking about a network and that produces relational goods, and these relational goods are included in exchanges. There's several positive things that happen. One is that it changes the terms and level of trade and the selection of trading partners. So those inside the network have certain advantages that those outside of the network don't. Furthermore, if with empathy and sympathy and so on, we tend to internalize the consequences of our actions, and so they don't become negative externalities within the network. We're more likely to invest in public goods. And because of our ability to exchange both commodities and relational goods, we can take a lot of the sharp edges off of inequalities. And there's important work. So the flip of those, if you're outside of the network and you're looking in and you see, boy, I'm not enjoying the benefits that they are, it may make you, one, resent the members of the social capital rich network, or two, try and create an alternative. And so what I want to talk about is, what do you do? What's your substitute if you don't belong to a social capital rich network? So, and I talked about cheap social capital, which is really the antipathy, lack of sympathy, fear, and disregard that one person has for another group. But we can use that, two people that share negative or cheap social capital for the same object may form a network of cheap social capital. And their commonality is their shared cheap social capital for another person or group. So I guess the next question might be is, why do we call it cheap? And the reason is that it's expensive to create and maintain. And the second reason is it's an imitation of real social capital. In other words, it can't provide a lot of the benefits and so on. So why is it inexpensive to build a cheap social capital? Sort of remembering that cheap social capital begins with commonalities. So in that case, strangers are natural objects of cheap social capital because even if they have commonalities, they haven't been discovered. And then there is the tendency to sort of identify our commonalities as really good and their commonalities as inferior. And third, we don't even have to have real differences of commonalities. They can be imagined or lied about and so on. And lastly, anyone with whom we compete can be an object if the competition becomes personalized. So it's cheap for some of those reasons. And it's inferior because it doesn't produce the same kind of relational goods that are produced in social capital networks. And as a result, their role in exchange of commodities is much different than relational goods produced in social capital networks. The other main difference is that when your network is organized around cheap social capital, then your goals are tend to be defensive and destructive. And you want to, first of all, restrict the object of your cheap social capital to do any damage. And if you're competing, to reduce their advantages. And the second point is, because of these goals are defensive and destructive, we don't see cheap social capital networks doing much to improve commodity inequalities or public good or investments. And the other point, and all of these we'll talk about in a little bit, is that because of the relationship with the objects, there's a tendency to try and weaken formal institutions to take advantage of the objects of our cheap social capital. And again, we'll talk about that. So just a quick note, what I'm proposing is perhaps a new line of research. And in order to pursue that, we need some kind of scale for measuring the strength of relationships, antipathy and sympathy and so on. One possibility is the Bogartis social distance scale, and that's been used successfully. So there is, I guess, thinking ahead to how this could be optimized. And of course, the other thing that we hope to be able to do is explain predictably irrational behavior that that perhaps we haven't addressed. Now, I don't have, because this is sort of a new approach to, or a new line of research, mostly what I'm going to be presenting are examples of different manifestations of cheap social capital. So let's begin with motives, because we have our preferences defined over commodities and relational goods. We're led to identify 5 different goals. And I should say that these 5 goals appeared one day on my blackboard when Steve Hansen was visiting. And we had a wonderful conversation, but I just want to say that that was where we started. So the first one is commodity gains. That would be a traditional neoclassical motive. There is an internal validation that we like to think well of ourselves. External validation, we'd like others to think well of us. We would like to feel we belong. And then we manifest our altruism or antipathy by either providing advantages or disadvantages to our objects. Now, here is the main point of whether or not our network is based on sympathy and empathy, or antipathy and lack of sympathy, will create important differences on the actions that follow from our motives. It will make an important distinction between how we pursue profits, how we pursue external validation, whether we act with empathy or antipathy, how we pursue our internal validation, and how we increase our sense of belonging. And to make this point, in our next, in the motives on the left, and then on the right, I've listed some actions that people in the cheap social capital network might pursue. They they might reduce the attachment value. They might use cheap social capital to form a network. They may be motivated to shift blame and responsibility, or conceal the truth, invest in defensive or destructive investments, or reduce an object's opportunities for trade. Now, I don't have lines drawn columns because any action may have more than one motive, in fact, several motives. And part of what we have done, some of our research has been looking at the relative importance of these motives for such things as getting an education and get a healthcare screen, a number of things. We simply want to know what's the dominant motive, and that helps us respond. So that's the main point, that how we act based on our motives will depend on whether or not we have cheap social capital or social capital. So I'm going to go through about 8 illustrations, and then I've suggested a research question that might be pursued with each one. So let's begin with number 1. The cheap social capital and objects of cheap capital can be used to create a cheap social capital network. So I think Ellie said that an unpopular ruler should start a war to gain support of this subject. Well, the Argentina in 1982, who were becoming quite unpopular, decided to try this approach and started a Falklands War, or the Malvinas Islands War, which was a good thing to do from their standpoint, because Argentinians believed the Falkland Islands really belonged to them anyway. But it didn't turn out very good, because the war didn't last very long, 10 weeks. It destroyed and cost a lot of lives. And in the end, because they failed, the government in Argentina was brought down, while the government of Margaret Thatcher, who was also struggling with their popularity, became very successful, and the Conservatives won the next election. So one of the actions that cheap social capital can produce is identify an unpopular object and use that as a basis for creating a network. Number 2 is cheap social capital networks, because they're organized around a shared antipathy toward an object that they may view with suspicion or fear, tend to make defensive and destructive investments. And of course, the disadvantage is that it diverts resources for more productive purposes. And so that's a testable hypothesis. As cheap social capital networks increase in importance, do they increase investments? And of course, I've chosen for my example this what some might call a beautiful wall. I'm not sure it looks beautiful to me, but so far it's cost about $10 billion. And I suppose there would be other things we could have done with that. Exercise or observation number 3 is cheap social capital network members tend to adopt or replace institutions, that is the rules for organizing behavior, so that they have greater advantage and are better able to harm the objects of cheap social capital. And you see a picture here. After a world of labors, prison labors, convict labors, after the end of the Civil War, most Southern states adopted what have been referred to as black laws, which were very restrictive, and they applied or frequently to black males for almost insignificant offenses, such as moving around without permission. They would be convicted of whatever this black laws allowed, and then they were leased to farms and mines and other activities for which the state was paid for their labor, so that in 1898 in the state of Alabama, 73% of their state labor came from the convict lease program. So number 4 is sometimes opportunities for economic gain and a lack of sympathy motivate actions that disadvantage their objects. Well, there's a number of ways that we can conduct economic exchanges, but we wonder what would motivate such actions. In this case, as early as 1953, cigarette companies recognized the connection between lung cancer and smoking. And instead of warning their consumers, they actually made cigarette smoking more addictive. So I don't know if you can read these 2 advertisements of the era. One says, "Most doctors smoke Camels." And here is a famous movie star who at least was popular in my era, John Wayne, and who is clearly a Camels guy. So the testable hypothesis is, would you do that to your family? Would you take that kind of action if you were trading within your social capital network? Would you sell a used car with a big problem to your sister, but maybe you wouldn't think anything about it to someone with whom was the object of your cheap social capital? So number 5, their cheap social capital can motivate those guilty of misdeeds to shift responsibility or to use a cause for support. And in this example, I have 2 pictures of the cruiser USS Maine that in 1898 was blew up in Havana Harbor. Of course, at the time, no one knew why it blew up, but several newspapers in the US said that it was because Spain blew it up, and the rallying came, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." And of course, that led to the Spanish-American War, which was short-lived. But after some reflection, Spain probably had nothing to do with it. It was more likely coal dust that was, a spark was lit. So objects of cheap social are really good places to shift blame. One of the problems of being the object of cheap social capital is that you are excluded from commodity exchanges and opportunities to specialize that would advance your economic condition. Early in our study of social capital, we did a multi-state survey of land values and how these might change depending on the relationship between the buyer and the seller. This is kind of a summary graph of that study, which found that if there were people that you didn't like, sellers on average would charge 18% above the market price. Well, no one's going to pay 18% above the market price. And as a result, there were less than 2% of reported sales ever went to nasty neighbors or people that were the objects of capital. So the research question is, as cheap social capital increases, does it become increasingly difficult to complete exchanges? Are we excluded? Without accounting for the relational debts. And I would just like to make clear a distinction. Cheap social capital is really just the object of social capital. Instead of viewing someone with sympathy and empathy, you view them, or at least the object, with antipathy and lack of sympathy. The network, the cheap social capital network, is created as people who share the object. That is, they all hate the same person. The enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of idea. They form the cheap social capital network. And the last one that I really want to talk about is there is some action that requires group consensus and compromise. In other words, to get where we want to go, we have to cooperate. This is particularly relevant in Congress. And if we had more time, we could spend some time on some really interesting studies. But just looking at from 1994 to 2014, as measured by the kind of support for legislation, the about 90% of the Democrats are to the left of the median position for Republicans, and the same is true on the other side. And the result of this is that we have a very hard time getting any kind of legislation passed because the political parties have almost become the objects of each other's social capital. So, and then the last one, I guess the research question is, can we measure this sort of inability to compromise? The last one I want to talk about is one of the ways that we can disadvantage an object is by destroying their high attachment value goods. And one of the attachment value goods that most large companies have is their brand. In this case, the brand is H&M, a Swedish retailer. And this is also true for Nike and Adidas, which is suffering the same problem. They criticized the Chinese government's use of Muslim labor, and it offended the Chinese government. And as a result of that, H&M was removed from store locators and not allowed to access Alibaba, the electronic exchange network. So that's one of the things that we do. I had a clip that I was going to show you that was played at the Super Bowl where they were looking at an apocalypse, and out of the debris, someone drives a Chevy truck, and they meet some other people driving Chevy truck, and they ask about one of their colleagues, and the response was he was driving a Ford and didn't make it. So there's lots of really wonderful examples. Now, the last part, and I want to leave time for questions, is, and I'll not spend a lot of time because I don't have a lot of results, but the question is, how can we avoid or mitigate some of the high cost of cheap social capital? And one way is to support formal institutions. A lot of the progress that we've had in civil rights is a result of supporting formal institutions that have reduced the ability of these informal institutions to differentiate and harm objects of cheap social capital. The second one is to develop widely inclusive commonalities. So what is it that we all share? In some places, universal service is required, which is a great way to provide everyone with a base. During wars, we, in our recent world wars, World War I, World War II, where it was generally supported and there was widespread participation we built a reservoir of goodwill, earned goodwill, that really, I believe, had some important economic consequences. One of the problems that our new media and exchange of information has created is echo chambers of ideas where people only listen to like-minded people, and that makes it very easy to make people with alternative voices into the objects of your cheap social capital. So somehow, and I'm not sure how, we need to provide a format where we are listening to alternative voices, that we hear more than just the echo chamber of our own ideas. And in an earlier slide, I indicated that social capital, although enabled by commonalities, when it leads to synergistic exchanges of commodities and relational goods, is the process for building social capital. And so one of the things that we need to do is sort of enable those kind of exchanges. And of course, just the opposite occurs when we have cheap social capital, we create barriers to trade and other ways. So one solution is to really look for opportunities for synergistic exchanges. And then this slide, it's from a book, The Hero's Journey. And what it talks about is that a lot of art need not be in competition with someone else, but really in competition with our sort of our best self, trying to overcome our individual limitations to reach to a higher performance. And so perhaps competition isn't the only game in town. Perhaps we could think a little bit about the hero's journey. Now, this is the last one, and I'm going to end my presentation on this. And it is refused to create objects of cheap social capital. There's lots of good examples, but here's one that I particularly like. It happened in a campaign stop for John McCain. And I'm going to play just a brief clip from this John McCain in this town hall meeting.
These days, it's hard to imagine a politician praising an opponent. But John McCain did it when the stakes were at their highest. Here's Lee Cowan.
It was an October surprise, unlike most.
I'm concerned about, someone that, cohorts with domestic terrorists such as...
3 weeks before voters would decide the next president of the United States, John McCain, trailing in the polls, told a crowd of supporters Barack Obama was a good man.
I have to tell you, he is a decent person and a person that you do not have to be scared as President of the United States. Now,
Getting booed at your own town hall can't be easy. But John McCain plowed ahead, extolling the differences between debating an opponent and demeaning one.
He's an Arab. He is not. No?
No, ma'am. He's a decent family man, citizen that I just happen to have disagreements with on fundamental issues, and that's what this campaign is all about.
The morning after, the man who would beat him thanked him.
I appreciated his reminder that we can disagree while still being respectful of each other.
Those few moments before that Minnesota crowd seemed to define what being a maverick really meant to John McCain. He saw the aisle dividing his party from the other as just that, an aisle, not a chasm where common decency is swallowed whole.
Because that's the way politics should be conducted in America.
He turned those boos into cheers. And for a moment anyway, the idea of bipartisanship, of statesmanship, even of friendship in Washington seemed oddly possible. Lee Cowan, CBS News, Los Angeles.
McCain had ideals, as he said in his farewell.
So this is my great grandson who will close this seminar presentation. Go ahead, Ezra.
No, keep sugar.
Okay, that's the end. There is a, I'm ready to take a question. I will say that I have a Facebook page, Cheap Social Capital Facebook page, and I would love to hear your contributions of examples of behavior or actions that have resulted from cheap social capital. Unfortunately, they're not hard to find. So I'm now ready to take your question.
Thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation and very thought-provoking one. If you can see the audience, we have about 78 participants on this seminar today. They will all be doing what I'm doing right now, clapping. So thank you very much. So we have a few questions, and I'll start out by reminding you that if you have a question for Lindon, you can type it in the question and answer chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So I'm going to go through a few questions now. Some of them are related. I will link them when appropriate, but the very first question is from one of your former mentees from the 1990s. This is Wagner Mendez, and this is his question for you, if I can. Okay, so he wants to know if you have considered some differences in social capital between developed and developing countries.
So, well, first of all, greetings to you, Wagner. Those of us that have been around, had some international experience, one of the things that has always been interesting to me, at least during some of my visits to Latin American countries, has been the importance of informal institutions organized around inherited social capital. So, for example, to get a loan in one country I was at, you had to know someone in the bank. Positions in the government were made available not through commonalities, but through sort of inherited. And so that's obviously not universal, but the important differences between, I think, economies that I've looked at is sort of the absence of widespread networks based on earned commonalities. And they, as I mentioned during the presentation, those are the kind of networks that are best adapted to conduct commodity exchanges. And when you have to rely on networks organized around inherited commonalities, simply don't function nearly as well.
Okay, the next question is from Sodia Delaja. When the cost of attaining social capital becomes high, does that make the cheap social capital pathway to achieving one's objectives more desirable? For example, in conflict research, we often agree that terrorists and other non-state actors become radical when they no longer believe that existing institutions can deliver their goals, and when they feel that their goals are more important than human life.
Well, Soja, you could probably answer that question better than any one of us on this meeting. And you know, and your research has supported that when you are excluded from the social capital network and you don't have the time and resources to create your own social capital network, that your approach is often to identify an object and then use that object to create your own social capital or your cheap social capital network. So absolutely. And I think, thank you for emphasizing that point.
The next two questions are political in nature, and I believe that they are somehow related. The first one is from Tom Jane, and this is the question. Lindy, you've been providing social emotional goods to others in AFRE for decades. Thank you. And I join him in saying thank you too. Here comes the question. Is there objective criteria for evaluating whether a particular behavior constitutes social capital or cheap capital? Take an extreme example, QAnon. Many of them may truly believe their motives and actions are upholding cherished values, producing social emotional goods, and consistent with the attributes of what you call social capital. Many others will disagree, of course. Do underlying differences in values or one's information set determine whether certain actions are evaluated as social capital or cheap social capital? Or is there an objective way on which all could agree to differentiate between social capital and cheap social capital? And then he added one last sub-question here. This is Tom still speaking. If I hold antipathy for Hitler, am I creating anti-social capital?
So, Tom, thank you for that question. As always, they're very thoughtful. We might talk for just a minute about the criteria for identifying cheap social capital networks. And one of the first one is, if the goal of the network is mostly destructive and defensive and requires an object to maintain group solidarity, it is most likely a cheap social capital network. Now, on the other hand, when you are cooperating in a defense, in a destructive mode, there is every likelihood or every possibility, if the members come to exchange relational goods, that leads to the development of real social capital. So there is an interesting book out called Tribes, and the author of the book says that one of the ways that the conditions that we often create very strong social capital is for maintaining, is facing very stressful situation. And one of the examples that he gave was soldiers in combat that depend on each other and experience this sense of solidarity and sympathy and empathy. When they leave the war zone, re-volunteer because they found such social emotional good within their network, even though their network was primarily organized for destructive and defensive means. So it's a work in progress, and there have been many network that may started out as a cheap social capital network that may be morph into some kind of social capital network. Not sure if I answered all of the questions.
He'll probably follow up with you later for more discussion. So before I go to the next question, I just want to make a quick announcement that after the question and answer session, we will have some time to hear some remarks from Lindy's colleagues, and then after that, we will have an open forum for discussions across the group. And some of you may have some memories that you like to share, or some reflections on Lindy's career. You have some time at the end, so I want you to be aware of that. So we've had several questions because this is a very thought-provoking session. So if I don't get to your question immediately, don't worry, I see it. I'm going in the order in which I received the questions. So the second question here, as I mentioned, is a little related because it's political to Tom's question. And this is a question by Jeff Jordan. It is hard to hear your definition of cheap social capital without thinking of the events and consequences of January 6th. How is it that it seems that cheap social capital, at least at the present, seems stronger than empathy and sympathy, and how is cheap social capital defeated?
Hi, Jeff, and thank you for that question. You know, I would that social capital dominated. That would be my strongest desire, that that social capital carrying antipathy and all those things. But like Kenneth Boulding versified, love is slow to propagate. The January 6th storming of the Capitol was a class book or a classroom case of having tried to create a network of cheap social capital by making Congress and individuals in Congress their objects. And so by perpetuating a lie that the election had been stolen and that certain people were responsible, that was used to really create the network or the object, the cheap social capital network that led to the storming of the Capitol, and something that was frightening, something that I don't think any of us could have imagined a year ago. So yes, we're living in the world of cheap social capital and cheap social capital networks. And the second part of your question is easy to answer and almost very hard to do. Going back to the clip that we played with John McCain, you may be aware that at his funeral, he had invited Barack Obama to speak. And so when groups, different political positions, could see two people approaching those without making each other the object of cheap social capital, that is a powerful example and a powerful message. So one of the things that I think we all need to be examples of refusing to make other people the objects of our cheap social capital. And I have to confess that it's very tempting when you're in a group to try and make yourself seem a little more popular, to engage in saying negative things about others, and then I feel bad afterwards. My grandson and his wife had me watch the movie Mean Girls. And having granddaughters that are teenagers, they tell me stories about cliques and how cliques need an object and so on. Boy, Jeff, write a paper on this and tell us how to get out of this mess. We truly need a way out.
Thanks. So the next question, you've actually started to answer it, but if you want to add to your to the comments you already provided, you can. And the question is from David Robison. For people to belong to cheap social capital networks, what are 3 concrete steps to enhancing social capital?
Hi, David. Let me make sure I understood the question. What are 3 steps that we can take to develop social capital?
Yes.
Okay. So the first one is to develop commonalities, get to know each other, engage in activities that bring together people with different experiences, backgrounds, and so on. And second, which is related to that, is we need both bonding and linking social capital. We need both of them. And when we only have bonding social capital, we suffer economically and in other ways. So we need to provide opportunities and sort of limits on how bonding networks have institutions that sort of limit the ability of bonded networks to inflict harm on their objects. Now, one of the things that's important is when the networks, us versus them, are based on inherited traits, genealogy, age, gender, and so on. There is no way that if you're the object that you can earn the commonality that allows you to enter into the network. And so we simply have to be willing and to let those. And David, when I think about it a little bit more, I'll give you number 2 and number 3.
That's good. So the next question is from Melissa McKendry. Thank you for sharing your ideas, Lindy. How do the ideas of social capital and cheap social capital tie into the broader discussions that society is having on diversity, equity, and inclusion?
So thank you. That's a great question. So I'll give you an example. When I go in to buy an airline ticket, I can pay with accumulated miles or money. And usually having 2 goods to trade, we can find a combination that makes it possible for me to buy an airline ticket. There may be occasions where I may not have enough commodities or money to buy the ticket, and so I can't. When we have networks that are exchanging both relational goods and commodities, we can most often find a combination that comparative advantage and so allows us to reduce the hard edge of inequality of commodities. For example, when my grandson asks for a mint, or when his mother is not around for a chocolate, he doesn't pay for it with commodities. He simply says, Grandpa, and I give it to him and hope that his mom and dad don't discover it. So inequality and cheap social capital, or the absence of social capital, I think are fundamental causes of inequality, both in access to resources and privileges and so on. Public investments in public goods require a position that you're quite willing to see other people benefit from your investment. And you, like my neighbor who was would vote for our school millages, even though they had no children in the school district, because that was part of their community. So the challenge that we are facing is that social capital is expensive to build. It's a cottage industry. It requires that you get to know people on an individual basis, that you join and participate in groups and activities that aren't necessarily where you're at, and simply work harder for and make it easier to build these earned commonalities that, like John McCain and Barack Obama, were more important than their different political position. And I really like basketball games. And one of the best parts is after the game, the players and the coaches, except one notable exception, shake hands. They're saying, look, this was a contest. But it didn't have to become it didn't have to become this. You didn't have to become my object of cheap social capital.
All right, thank you.
I would love to visit with you some more about that.
All right, thank you. So as I mentioned earlier, we got a lot of questions because this is a very interesting topic. But for the sake of time, I will limit the questions that I answer to the next 5, and then I'll wrap up there so we can move on to the next thing. So I'm hoping that we can do this in the next 7 to 10 minutes. So the next question is, I don't have a name for this, but the comment first, Dr. Robison, thank you. You touched on tobacco and addiction. Curious what you think about the access to nicotine, alcohol, opioids, etc. Also in our current world, access to masks and such. There seems to be a complete difference in access to each. Does this dichotomy show cheap social capital?
Could you repeat that last sentence?
Access to 2 types of commodities, nicotine, alcohol, opioids, in contrast to access to mask and those kind of things. The differences between access to each, does that show the economy in how cheap social capital is formed?
What a great question. That's really super. So we don't have to focus on just tobacco. We can focus on opioid, unhealthy foods, a ton of things, and the willingness to inflict harm on consumers or our exchange partners without them knowing it is a result of cheap social capital. It comes from in other words, if I can't identify with the people consuming the product, and therefore my only interest is in pursuing profit, that is a path that we would pursue if there were cheap social capital. In contrast, if we cared about people that we're consuming, that we're selling to, we would not conceal, we would not build into our product harmful substances and so on. So yes, the way we do business and how we conduct it also depends on our own sort of code of conduct. But yes, indeed, it is a product of cheap social capital.
Thank you. The next question and comment is from My Wish Maridia. Oh no, I'm skipping one. I think you may know this person very well. This comment and question is from Logan Robison. Have you discovered in your research an example when cheap social capital provided a good outcome? For example, unified dislike for a corrupt leader that caused his or her removal from power.
Well, yes, we can have good outcomes when, even though the network started as a cheap social capital, it morphs into a social capital network. The United States at the beginning of World War II was reluctant to enter in support of Great Britain and the Allies. They had just had a very costly war. And after Pearl Harbor, the country was united in their opposition to the Axis powers. It brought about a unified response, a war effort that lasted for several years. One of the interesting things that happened, all of the things that we've mentioned, car production dropped as factories were diverted to producing war material. I think there were about 38 cars produced during that era. And so there was a lot of social capital, there was a lot of patriotism. It's a shame. I mean, the number of lives lost and the number of resources that were destroyed. It's hard to feel very good about that. A lesser form of that is, I think most of us have participated on some form of team, a sports team, or it may have been an orchestra or something where we had some kind of object we had to overcome. Maybe it was the difficulty of playing the music, maybe it was the performance of men, and so on. So we use that a lot. I mean, hopefully we don't let it get all the way to the status of cheap social capital, that we actually hate our opponents. So there are very good outcomes. In the world of business, someone makes a product and that becomes the standard for other people trying to improve on their production. So yes, Logan. Logan is my grandson.
Very good.
He works for Walmart, actually, in Bentonville, Arkansas.
Good question. So those discussions at home have definitely had some influence on that question. So the next question is from My Wish Meridia, and I'll only be able to take two more questions, even though there are many more questions in front of me. For the sake of time, we will share all the questions with Lindy, so he can follow up with some of you on some of those questions. And this could also be an opportunity too to kind of follow up with Lindy with your question.
Yes, please send me your question in an email, and I promise I'll respond.
Okay. So second to the last question here. Great presentation, Lindy. So this is from My Wish Meridia. I thoroughly enjoyed it. My question is as follows. Maybe this was not intended, but when you said that the opposite of social capital is cheap social capital, are you dividing the world into two types, social capital and cheap social capital? What about the absence of both? People who are agnostic or ambivalent or do not belong to any network, are there socioeconomic costs to not having either social capital or cheap social capital?
Well, thank you, My Wish, for that wonderful question. And I can't think of anyone better prepared or better qualified to answer that question than you are. The challenge that I see, and perhaps you have as well, is almost everyone has some kind of bonding network. Their family or extended family. I mean, that's not 100% true, but at least at least most of the cultures that I see have bonding networks. The problem is they're small and they're inflexible and they don't have access to many resources. And so unfortunately, they're often poor, where the larger networks that are organized around earned commonalities have all of the other advantages, and not being able to break into the social capital networks or even the business networks. I mean, you could have a network where what connects us is the ability to make profit. And so, yes, there are people that don't belong to a network that are disadvantaged, and some people belong to networks without resources that are disadvantaged. So, your question is really spot on.
That's very good. And this is our last question before we transition to the next item on our schedule today. And this is from one of your colleagues, retired colleague, John Stats.
Oh, hi, John.
So, and here's his question. Can you comment on the difficulties of developing shared earned commonalities when participating in those is conditioned by inherited commonalities? For example, racism that leads to separated neighborhoods, access to higher education.
Yeah. Well, again, John, you're better prepared to answer this than I am, but yes, some of the inherited commonalities lead to separated neighborhoods, separated churches, separated schools, separated shopping facilities, separated experiences, and these all tend to perpetuate the object status for cheap social capital networks. And I think one of the advantages of where you can bring children together in sports or schools or any number of activities is a good place to start. Most neighborhoods connect through their children, and it's particularly is that if you are a member of a minority that's an object or excluded from the main cheap social capital network, you're going to economic disadvantages. If you look at income distributions among classes of group, if you're excluded from these earned groups, you simply have this. And I wish I had a better answer, John, and you've been working your entire career to try and make this good happen. And by participating in development activities around the world and bringing goodwill across countries and all kinds of other inherited traits, I mean, you have done a wonderful work. We need more of that. We need to visit each other's places. We need to engage in a wide variety of activities. We need to eat each other's foods and sing each other's songs and listen to each other's religious views. We simply need people committed to that ethos.
That's wonderful. I just want to thank you for an excellent presentation. Because it's such an excellent talk, it stimulated and elicited some really excellent questions and discussions afterwards. I believe that this work will continue, and I've said this to you in private before, that this area of research is very rich and has so many applications, and I'm hopeful as you are, that many others will take on the issues and questions that I raised from this line of thinking about how relational goods and social capital affects the way we make choices and policies in our society. So this has been excellent. So thank you very much.